Hello. Okay, so today we are shifting gears again, and we're going to talk a little bit about uh, climate change and climate violence. The reading for today is by sociologist Eric Bonds. And the paper that we looked at is Upending Climate Violence Research, Fossil Fuel Corporations and the Structural Violence of Climate Change. Um, So before we get into this, that article, want to talk a little bit more generally about sort of the ideas in the paper and climate change in general. One of the big ideas here is the idea of structural violence. And having just discussed Frantz Fanon and colonialism, uh, we have some sense of structural violence, right? The way that a society can be organized to benefit some and oppress others, right? The structure of colonial government would have a lot of structural violence involved in it, right? Sort of the most straightforward example we could think of structural violence would be slavery, right? A system that um, structurally permits the oppression, exploitation, and torture of certain segment of people. We hear a lot about systemic racism, structural violence in relation to white supremacy and race. Um, Sorry, I'm getting a FaceTime call. Um, and so, what do we mean by this, right? I mean, I think the connection I want to make here um, uh, is just about the possibility of structural violence, right? Uh, Again, I think understanding or thinking about uh, racism and race through the lens of colonization uh, helps to understand the idea of structural racism, systemic racism in the United States and elsewhere. Uh, it's interesting, I think, uh, to apply those ideas, that idea of structural violence, uh, to climate change, to environmentalism, right? Which is exactly what Eric Bonds in this essay is doing. The essay is from 2016, 5 years ago. And so I think a lot of this argument has been um, pretty well incorporated into the discourse by now. But it's still worth reviewing, going over. I think it's a good essay. Um, Now, the kind of structural violence that Bonds is analyzing uh, primarily has to do with the fossil fuel companies uh, and the way the political system in the US uh, is structured to benefit the fossil fuel companies. Um, the advantage given to corporations in general and polluting corporations, fossil fuel corporations in particular. So, I think it's interesting um, that in this analysis of the structural violence of climate change, uh, and fossil fuels, we also get a critique of capitalism and a critique of the sort of neoliberal political state that is, in bed with capitalism, in bed with corporations. Uh, so, you know, I think to start off with, it's helpful to think about sort of larger structural picture here before we get a little bit more specific uh, with the Bonds essay. And when we're thinking about structures, systems, uh, we're immediately led to also um, what's sometimes thought of as the superstructure, which is sort of the historical and ideological conditions that justify and facilitate the systems and structures that then facilitate daily life and individual moments of violence. The superstructure, uh, the ideology, the historical sort of moment, historical essence, um, is in our case, right, the superstructure of capitalism and capitalist ideology. Um, I think one of the most powerful articulations of one of the ideas of this superstructure came from uh, the climate activist, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg. Um, you know, yeah, and right what Greta Thunberg said in front of the U.S. Congress um, was to scold them for what she called a fairy tale of eternal economic growth. Uh, and I think if there is an item of superstructural ideology that is most connected to the structural violence of climate change, it is this idea of eternal economic growth. And this idea of eternal economic growth is very much an article of faith of classical liberalism. It goes back to John Locke and to the idea that capital growth, accumulation of property, is not in itself an injustice. That the accumulation of property is only a problem when my property threatens to take away your opportunity to pursue your own property. Uh, so Locke will say, John Locke, an 18th century political philosopher, um, will say essentially, right, that it is economically justifiable to accumulate as much property as you can, and the only moment where accumulation of property becomes problematic is when there is literally no more property left for anyone else. Uh, Now, right, Locke, writing in the 18th century, at the beginning of the imperial and colonial era, uh, has an easy time imagining a world, the entire world is just property waiting to be claimed through imperialism and colonization, through uh, you know exploration, expansion. Um, in the 18th century, it was an ideology, an economic theory that was, I think, it's safe to say, uh, exclusively for Europeans, particularly the English who we remember from briefly talking about it in our Fanon discussion about colonialism, were running out of land. And this is why one of the reasons why the British went to the New World, went to America, was to, right, find land. And Locke's theory is there should be no limit to individual property. Uh, as long as each individual has enough to survive and is able to, go out and pursue more property on their own terms, then no individual should be prevented from pursuing property. I think we can talk more about that in class. Locke's theory of property. Uh, I think one of the things that's really interesting about climate change and the philosophy of climate change is that it kind of inherently challenges uh, that article of faith in liberal democratic, classical liberal ideology, right? Uh, that the idea of living in a closed system like the planet, right? One of the main differences between Locke's time and our own time is our conception of the planet, our conception of the finitude of natural resources, right? That natural resources are not infinite. Uh, and that therefore the whole economy, the picture of the global economy changes. And we can no longer believe, certainly not in the same way, that there is an infinite amount of potential property out there. And so the finitude, the limits of the planet, of the global community, impose the necessity uh, of economizing those resources, right? So that it no longer makes sense for one individual, one corporation, or one country to pursue without limit, unendingly, as much property as possible. That the effect of one individual person or corporation's pursuit of property uh, is much more visible. Uh, we have a better sense of the economy of resources, the global economy in general. And so, environmental ethicists and environmental thinkers in general, um, present a challenge to the capitalist modus operandi that is different from the Marxist challenge. There's a lot of overlap, I think, um, in terms of, right, what the critiques are, and also, what the solution might be in terms of, right, sharing resources, of limiting the amount of resources that any individual has a right to own and accumulate. Um, but the logic of the argument is very different. The logic of the argument on the environmentalist side is not about the exploitation of the worker. Uh, it's about the exploitation of the earth, right? The exploitation of natural resources and the impoverishment of you know humanity as a whole that is a result of the endless accumulation by a few individuals. Um, so I think this is one of the interesting questions of our moment, right, of the last 50 to 10 years, is how do we, well, how will the climate movement, the movement for environmental justice, uh, relate to the Marxist and labor movements? Um, they have a common enemy, right? They share many of the same critiques of capitalism. Uh, and the question is, right, how do they meet up? How do they link up, the labor movement and the environmental movement? Uh, we have a number of sort of broad ways of thinking about environmentalism and what environmental justice, environmental ethics is about. Uh, Environmentalism begins, right, as we know it, in the 20th century. I mean, you can make arguments um, that environmentalism begins really in the 19th century with reactions against industrialization. We could understand the Luddites who were against industrial technology as sort of forebearers, precursors to the environmental movement. We could certainly include Henry David Thoreau and even certain, American romanticist poets like Emerson and Walt Whitman as part of kind of environmental consciousness, consciousness of environmental degradation that is, an inevitable part of industrialization, right? And Henry David Thoreau's, moving into the woods to, build his own house, make his own, um, you know, feed himself to the extent that he did, and all of that. We can understand that as, um, one of the first sort of environmental reactions against the modern world and industrialization, a kind of back to nature movement. There were a number of these sort of communes in the transcendentalist movement in the United States in the mid 19th century. Bronson Alcott, also a New Englander, friends with Henry David Thoreau, had another commune, I believe it's called Fruitlands, that was a kind of back to nature experiment. So, we can I think we properly understand the environmental movement as having roots in reaction against industrialization and urbanization at the beginning of the 19th century, and we see expressions of that throughout the 19th century in different ways. But the environmental movement, the modern environmental movement, which is about, has not just this sort of reactive escape from modernity or destruction of modernity, which is the Luddites. Um, we find those origins in the early 19th century. One of the common sort of founding figures of environmentalism is the naturalist John Muir, uh, who started the Sierra Club. And John Muir, whose writings are about sort of the beauty of nature, the importance of nature to the human spirit, is a conservator essentially. And John Muir was sort of in the same milieu as Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, who whatever you think of him as a president in other respects, set aside huge amounts of wild territory to be the national park system, right? So conservation was sort of the first stage in the environmental movement, and we can think of John Muir as one of the main figures in that beginning period of environmentalism. That conservationism of early environmentalism, however, is you know certainly good, right? But in the 50s and 60s, particularly in the 60s, the environmental movement reaches another stage. Uh, and at this stage, right, um, the problem appears much greater, right? And it appears that conservation of land is not going to be enough, uh, not going to be enough to preserve nature, to to staunch the expansion of industrialization and the degradation of nature. By the time we get to the 60s, we have really harmful levels of air and water pollution. If you look at pictures of LA from the 60s, there's a huge layer of smog that just hangs over the city permanently. Um, you have, in the 60s, more sort of pedestrian conservation efforts. You have the beautification uh, movement to clean up highways and things like that. So pollution and the degradation of nature are becoming much more visible, much more obvious in the 60s. And um, environmentalism becomes less about conserving the nature that is untouched by industrialization, and more about transforming industrial society itself, right? To conceive of a society that is not driven by industrialization, not driven by uh, the fairy tale of eternal economic growth, by endless development. And so in the 60s, we get a movement that is sometimes called deep ecology. And this was introduced by, I believe he was a Norwegian philosopher, Arne Nass. Uh, and Nass's argument, um, his deep ecology, is that our fundamental conception of human is part of the cause of the degradation and destruction of nature. That uh, beginning, with in the modern world, as the product of modern philosophy, we understand the world as being separated uh, into two camps, two realms, essentially. On the one hand, we have uh, humans, human mind, human society. And on the other hand, we have nature as the object of society, the object of human being, right? And this goes back to the mind-body duality of Rene Descartes. It goes back to fundamental philosophical distinctions between uh, the human being and the other animals, the human being and society from the state of nature, nature in general, right? That we understand society to be absolutely separate from nature, and the human being to be fundamentally different from the animals. We are made in God's image. We have transcendental reason. We are, we have self-consciousness. We have language. We have all these things that, within philosophy, uh, theoretically separate us and put us at a remove from the rest of nature. And so conservation essentially continues this worldview in which society and nature, culture and nature are fundamentally separate, and the human being is categorically different from other animals and the rest of nature. Uh, Conservation aims to conserve those parts of nature that are beneficial to the human spirit, but it doesn't challenge the essential distinction between humans and nature. Arne Nass, deep ecology, and sort of spirit of environmentalism in the 60s, and then again certainly in the 70s, wants to more fundamentally challenge this distinction between culture and nature, between the human and the rest of the animal world, and to say, right, that in order to prevent uh, the further degradation of nature, and indeed a fatal degradation of nature, right, we have to dismantle this worldview in which uh, human society is fundamentally separate from nature. And this is a radical idea, and it means putting humans on the same level as other animals. It means renouncing our special philosophical theological place as the unique and superior being on Earth, and it means abandoning the thought that human beings are able to pursue their own logic, the logic of their own development through industrialization, urbanization, globalization, etc. And instead, the human beings need to understand themselves as dependent upon and as dependent parts within a global ecosystem, within an ecosystem, right? So the idea is not only are we destroying this beautiful nature, which is beneficial to the grandeur of the human spirit, but also that through the destruction of nature, we are dooming ourselves, right? That human society, human beings can't live uh, outside of the natural environment. And this delusion that we are not part of the natural environment threatens to destroy the very world that keeps us alive, that allows us to survive. So that now, right, in Arnonas's deep ecology and in related environmental philosophies, uh, capitalism is, let's say, industrialization is understood as an existential threat. Right? Uh, it threatens human society, threatens the survival of the planet. And I hesitate to say capitalism because, um, as we'll see and talk about, there are capitalist solutions to this problem also. Um, or in any case, capitalists argue there are capitalist solutions to this problem. Uh, so this deep ecology then argues that uh, it is not only the well-being of humans that we need to look out for, um, but that human well-being is caught up with and dependent upon the well-being of every member of the ecosystem, every member of the natural world. And so we have, Arnonas presents us with not an anthropocentric view of the world, a view of the world that puts the human being, the anthropos, at the center of being, and says everything is in the service of human well-being, but instead proposes an ecocentric view of the world, a view that puts the ecosystem at the center, right? And so we can already see, right, an ecocentric view which privileges the ecosystem, the natural system, is not going to support this idea of eternal economic growth, right, or eternal growth in general. A system depends on regulation. Uh, system is regulation. And so to exceed the sort of normal regulation of a system with this infinite growth is to destabilize that regulated system, to throw it out of whack, and to put all members that benefit, that survive on the basis of that system in danger. So already a kind of ecocentric view, a view that recognizes humanity's dependence on the ecosystem and on nature, is going to confront, uh, sort of claim to uh, confront the idea of a unregulated, deregulated system like the economic system that believes it can achieve infinite growth. Right? It's just not practical. So, deep ecology uh, is kind of revolution in environmental ethics that fundamentally upsets the sort of standard philosophical establishment, philosophical understanding of the human relation to nature. Uh, Now, this is followed. Right? Arnanas is writing in the 60s, right? Um, Beginning writing in the 60s. Uh, and it's in the early 70s that climate change research, global warming becomes becomes popularized, right? Becomes part of mainstream discourse. I think the first mention of planetary warming is actually as early as 1923, or along those lines in the 1920s. But it becomes really a major issue in the 1970s. And the early history of climate change research and is interesting because there's a lot of uncertainty uh, in the beginning period of climate change research in the 70s, and there was a period, in fact, where it was the climatic danger that confronted us was in fact global cooling, that the Earth would become cool, and sometimes when you uh, if you get into an argument with a climate change denier or someone who's a climate skeptic and someone of a certain age, you'll hear them say this as an example not to trust the science. Right? Oh, those scientists are always going back and forth. Right? At first, they think that we have to worry about global cooling. Now they think that we have to worry about global warming, and that's correct. There was this moment where the science pointed to the possibility of global cooling. That was a brief moment in the 1970s, right? And since then, the consensus among scientists for the last 50 years, 40 some years, has been that the planet is warming, right? That the emission of greenhouse gases through burning of fossil fuels is clogging up the ozone and trapping more sunlight and thus heating the planet. Right? There are a number of different phenomena. Right? There's the hole in the ozone that's letting in more UV rays, and then there's the trapping of those harmful UV rays in the atmosphere, uh, both of which are symptoms of climate change and drivers of climate change. Uh, so, climate change research gets going in 1970. It becomes a major issue. Uh, and for a while, um, people are on board with this. Right? It is, I think, even Richard Nixon had an environmental bill, a bill that was aimed at addressing climate change. Maybe it wasn't called climate change, but addressing the degradation of nature. So there was a sort of brief moment in the early 70s when climate change was viewed by American politicians as a real problem, a problem that had real dangers associated with it, and that we needed to do something about. That moment is short-lived, and one of the sort of main points of this essay the Eric Bond's essay, is to discuss why that initial sort of credulity, belief in climate change research and the will to confront climate change disappeared, right? How the forces, fighting against climate change awareness and environmental justice gained power. Um, so, with the combination of deep, deep ecology, this new environmental philosophy, and growing awareness of climate change, uh, the knowledge that the main driver of climate change is fossil fuel emissions, uh, we get a wide array of new kinds of environmental theory, environmental ethics. Uh, One sort of offshoot of deep ecology that's worth mentioning is social ecology. And social ecology argues that while it's absolutely true that the human being is dependent on the environment and right, the ecosystem, the regulations of nature, of our nature in our world are critical for our survival, uh, at ethical standpoint, it is impractical to argue that all members of an ecosystem have equal standing and equal ethical uh, value. Right? For Arne Naess, and a deep ecologist, right, the rights of a human being are not more important, should not be privileged over the rights of uh, the whale, the polar bear, right? Any other, the magnolia tree outside. That we are all mere members and equal members in our environment, and the environment, right, the system, the ecology values each member equally. The system is constructed out of these members, and therefore no member is more important than any other. Uh, Social ecology will argue that from a human perspective, right, the human is always going to be more important. And while it is, necessary to preserve the environment and to protect species and animals and ecosystems in order to protect human beings, our protection of nature should always be understood as protection of ourselves, right? That we protect nature in order to protect ourselves. So for Arne Naess, deep ecologist, we could say we protect nature for its own sake, right? For the sake of the ecosystem. Uh, Nature is good in itself and for itself. With social ecology, we might say we protect nature for the sake of something else. Right? We protect nature for our own sake, and that nature is ultimately good, perhaps in itself, but ultimately the reason it matters is because it's good for us. Right? It's in our benefit. Um, and I think I'll mention one other moment in the development of environmental ethics. Another thinker who I think is important to know about, and she has a lot of material on the internet that you can find, uh, and that is a philosopher named Vandana Shiva. And Vandana Shiva, um, I think, is doing really interesting work on conceiving of a political model, conception of politics, of ethics, of law that would be both ecocentric in the sense that it believes that nature is good for its own sake, but also, right, understands that the human being, for the human being, is always going to hold a special place, right? We value our own existence more than we value the existence of others. And Vandana Shiva's important idea is the concept of what she calls an earth democracy, right? The idea that all uh, members of the ecosystem, the global ecology, uh, have their own sort of right to existence, uh, but that existence society, right? Mm, the kind of democratic understanding of ourselves in communion with nature. Uh, Vandana Shiva, will also make the argument that in order to transcend, to move away from the political and economic model that has led to global warming, environmental degradation, etc. What needs to happen is not just uh, the relinquishing of the privileged privileged position that humanity places itself in within the environmental system, within ecology, but that environmentalism and a genuinely ecocentric or ecologically sound, ecologically ethical political model would also mean, right, erasing the other forms of hierarchy that are present within the political economy of environmental destruction. And so Vandana Shiva is also often sort of regarded as a member of the feminist ecology movement. And feminist ecology, feminist environmentalism, argues that in order to reach this earth democracy, a manner of being that is in harmony with the natural world, that is not exploitative of natural resources, uh, that doesn't, right, view nature as an object for consumption, uh, that doesn't understand itself as a godlike entity that is pursuing unlimited power. In order to achieve that, we have to first dismantle the other forms of exploitation and domination within the political system. And this would mean dismantling uh, not only, right, racial hierarchy and racism. Uh, in particular, I think we'd understand that kind of racism as the exploitation through global economy, which we discussed a little bit in terms of colonization, right? The extraction of wealth from, quote, third world countries, the exploitation of third world countries for their resources, the amount of environmental damage that's done through extracting resources in Africa, in Asia, South America, everywhere. Right? We don't have to go to the third world. We can think of the environmental damage done through the extraction of resources in the United States also. But right, it is overwhelmingly in the third world where that kind of damage is being done. So that the racism of environmental damage would be, you know, partly the racism of the West in relation to the rest of the world. Uh, the other, right, but it would also have to do with right white supremacy, the more quotidian, sort of daily hierarchies and manners of oppression in the political system. Right? And the other, right, major form of exploitation and domination that feminist ecology talks about is, right, the exploitation that is the patriarchy, right? And I think it's interesting. We, in sort of again traditional philosophy, in sort of default ideology of Western philosophy, women are associated with nature, and men are associated with law, right, with society. And this is one of the many justifications for why men should, you know, be the master of the house, right? The person in charge, and why the man is given privileged position over the woman in the family and in society. Right? That women, in part through this connection to nature, or are they're connected to nature because of this, but right, women are viewed within the patriarchy as also being essentially, right, resources uh, that one, right, dominates and then uses for growth. Right? Women are there to maintain the home and reproduce, and as such are, right, viewed as resources of a kind, and that as long as this ideology of the patriarchy of the domination of women and the hierarchy that places men above women is in place, that the other hierarchies, the hierarchy of culture over nature, and the justification for the endless expansion of male dominated society is inevitable. Right? That in order to fight the exploitation and degradation of capitalism, of industrial society, one has to dismantle all hierarchies. All hierarchies are in the service, ultimately, of the hierarchy established between society and nature. If we're going to have a harmonious relationship with nature, we need to dismantle gender, sex-based, and racial hierarchies also. Uh, Now, all of this is of a piece, I think. Right? Environmentalism uh, has, according to its own logic, and according to the logic of the environment itself, environmentalism has positioned itself in important ways in opposition to sort of dominant ideology of capitalism, of economic growth. And this is one of the main reasons why, right, that moment of credulity in climate change, the moment of political will to deal with climate change evaporates, right? That if dealing with global warming, dealing with climate change requires a fundamental restructuring of society, a fundamental overturning of our dominant philosophy, and the dissolution of hierarchy, uh, right? Then, who is being challenged? Well, if not the individuals in power than the larger structure of power. Right? The corporate interests that are, so intimately tied to political power, uh, and right, the sort of norms of quote unquote Western society, right? Uh, the patriarchal, Eurocentric, expansionist values of Europe. So, right, we get this other form of environmentalism, uh, which really begins in the 20th century, maybe the 1990s, uh, which is kind of capitalist response to the problems of climate change. And not surprisingly, this is, if there are any sort of climate action has been successful, it is the capitalist approach, right? And the capitalist approach would have to do with, not fundamentally changing the economy, but regulating it slightly, right? Moving the chairs around, right? So, from a ecocentric perspective, from a deep ecological perspective, uh, a lot of this sort of capitalist solution to to climate change looks like, right, rearranging the chairs in the Titanic. That you can't solve the problem using the same system that created the problem. Uh, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that uh, this sort of market-based solution to climate change is so prevalent, and to acknowledge that it is, for the most part, not in line with these more radical environmental ethics. So perhaps the most famous sort of market-based solution would be the cap trade solution, right? That there would be a regulation on the amount of fossil fuels that a company is allowed to release uh, into the atmosphere, right? And that you could then create a market for emissions. So if you are a highly polluting company, you can buy pollution credits from a company that does not pollute, right? And if you're a company that does not pollute, you can market your lack of pollution to polluting companies, right? A market for carbon emissions. Right? Now, um, the problem, obviously, is that there is no uh, provision for the end of carbon emissions in this. Right? It says there has to be a cap on the total number of carbon emissions, but it doesn't say we need to eliminate carbon emissions. Um, Other sort of capital-based solutions would be green technology. Right? And green technology is, it seems like, the accepted solution to climate change now. Right? We just need to transform to a green economy, and this is certainly. I think there are versions of a green economy founded on green technology that can be brought into line with these more radical environmentalist ethics of deep ecology, the transformation of philosophy of nature, humans' relationship to nature, uh, the Green New Deal, right, which is sort of vague proposal that was introduced by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, I believe in 2017, as a resolution, is very much still amorphous, right? But the idea would be a complete transition away from the fossil fuel economy. Uh, you know, we'll have to think about that in detail. We need more details on what that looks like to know whether or not that, to what degree such a transition would meet these larger demands of environmental ethicists. Um, but right, in general, we imagine, um, we're getting right now. There's a heated debate about the meaning of infrastructure, and there's a $2.3 trillion proposal that Biden is sort of negotiating on right now that would introduce a lot of green technology and funding for uh, green projects. Um, Republicans are calling it the Green New Deal in disguise, and meanwhile, the people that you know are actually advocating the Green New Deal are saying Biden's proposal is way too small. Right? They project that the Green New Deal would a true Green New Deal that would actually accomplish a transition away from fossil fuels and meet the thresholds that need to be met in order to prevent the most disastrous uh, warming should be more in the range of $10 trillion. Um, now, uh, in any case, right, this new infrastructure bill and the possibility of an influx of investment in green technology would mean uh, could electric vehicles, high-speed trains, and expansion of train routes, um, expansion of wind farms, major investment in solar power, investment in research and development for green technology. Might also involve expansion of nuclear power, which, despite its own risks, is environmentally much cleaner than a lot of other forms of energy generation. Um, so, right, okay, that's my overview of the history of environmental ethics and environmentalism. Uh, let's talk a little bit more about the essay in particular. When we think about climate change, what do we think will be the consequences of climate change? Uh, Rising waters, of course, receding shorelines, coastal cities being flooded, uh, warming of large swaths of the planet, uh, right? Even warming to the point of uninhabitability in certain places. Right, already, the temperatures in places like Qatar are near uninhabitable. Uh, so that's the sort of baseline, right? The actual environmental consequences. Melting of the icebergs, rising sea levels, warming of the already warm zones. Then there are the secondary, indirect consequences of climate change. Uh, and these will include, um, you know, among other things, an increase in extreme weather events. Right? That's one that is mentioned very often. And extreme weather events would be not just heat waves. Right? Global warming is a symptom of climate change. Climate change has many and varied effects. And extreme weather events would be not just heat waves, not just the drastic increase, for example, in wildfires in California that we've seen over the last 5 years, but also other kinds of weather events. Uh, there's evidence showing that the extremely unusual cold snap in Texas that took down a power without power, that an ice storm in Texas in when was that? March. was a consequence of climate change, right? That not only do we get these firestorms, we also get more intense winter storms. We get the you know, hurricanes are more frequent and stronger. Right? This is also a phenomenon that we've been seeing. Right? There are now so many hurricanes in the season that they've stopped being able to name them according to the alphabet. Right? So more hurricane-sized storms and more massive hurricanes. Right? So in general, weather events become more extreme year-round. But also, right, as the climate changes, uh, the indirect consequences for humans will involve food shortages, uh, drought in some places, flooding in other places. Right? And extreme drought will lead to famine. Right? And there's already a pretty well established argument is that uh, as a result of the drought um, that will be caused by climate change and the famine in turn caused by that drought because suddenly farmland is desert, suddenly, right, productive regions become unproductive, right? As the climate changes, there's instability in nature, and that land that used to produce a living for people will no longer. The land that may in the future become, valuable won't be valuable yet because it's in a transitional period. And so, as a result of these famines, there's going to be mass migrations. Right? This is one of the main hypotheses of the impacts of climate change, and we're already seeing evidence that migration is increasing. Right, over the last 5 years, also, there's been a lot of discussion about the migration from Central America, in particular Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala. And one of the causes of that migration, I mean, there are many causes. There's, political unrest, there's insecurity, and we could talk about the causes of that political unrest and insecurity. But another cause is the changing ecology, right? The fact that that region has been hit by an historic drought, that farms aren't producing the way they used to, and there's less food, right? So the people are forced to migrate to where there's more food, more resources. So a lot of these migrants that are moving north from Central America through Mexico and coming, trying to come into the United States are climate refugees, right? Um, so when we think about climate change, we have to think about mass migrations also. Mass migrations, as we're already seeing in the United States, produce further political instability, further political anxiety and turmoil. Uh, changing demographics, changing populations is, not in itself necessarily a cause for political turmoil, but it certainly can be. So, this idea, right, that there will be indirect political and social consequences to climate change, not just climate change itself will directly kill people by making currently inhabitable regions uninhabitable, but also that as a result of those climatic changes, there will be social and political violence is a popular idea. And this is um, what one of the things Eric Bonds is arguing, uh, that our conception of indirect climate violence is problematic. Right? That very often, when people discuss uh, climate-related violence, they imagine the the equatorial, sub-equatorial worlds being thrown into a state of kind of anarchic violence. Right, that the state will collapse. Uh, the people will turn against each other, and there will be a kind of orgy of violence in the global south. And Bonds' first argument is that this perpetuates certain racist stereotypes, right? That, as we just mentioned, there's a kind of racism of the West against the rest of the world, in particular, from the northern hemisphere against the southern hemisphere. Right? We see this. This is sort of casual, garden variety racism, right? People that live in warm climates are lazy. Uh, you know, hot climates breed violence, this sort of thing. Uh, you know, um, Having just discussed colonialism, we can sort of, reflect on the irony, the extremely dark irony of, a European country going and colonizing a Caribbean island, throwing its social and political world into absolute chaos, dominating them, enslaving the population, etc. And then when there is, unrest, when there are violent outbursts uh, in those countries, saying, "Ah, well, it's the hot weather that does it," right? The people are just inherently violent down there, right? Couldn't have had anything to do with our violent domination of them. No, that's just how they are, right? So there's this sort of already existing racism that's based on climate, which is being perpetuated here. And, you know, when we talk about climate related migration, uh, one response that we hear, and we hear this, there are American politicians that are entertaining the reality of climate related migration and saying, the solution is to close the southern border, right? To prevent anyone from coming in. Right, they're climate refugees. That's going to lead to violence. We can't let that violence spread into our country. And at any ethical level, in any ethical theory, right, that would be a refusal of dealing with the consequences of your own actions. Right, the United States is the largest polluter, the largest emitter of fossil fuels in the world. Right? Is therefore the leading contributor to climate change. If climate change, consequently leads to refugees, and those refugees are seeking, more hospitable regions in the north, to refuse to accept them as refugees is, not to deal with the consequences of your own action. More generally, we could think about this from a deep ecological perspective, and recognize what a profound failure that kind of approach would be, right? That in response to the horrible consequences of acting as though individuals have no responsibility to the collective as a whole, don't need to participate in a regulated system, but have the potential for unlimited growth, to respond to that by, um, you know, doubling down on that individuality, right? The prerogative of the individual to act as an individual is only going to make the problem worse, right? That again, from a deep ecological perspective, the solution can only be to conceive of ourselves as a collective and to conceive of our survival as dependent on operating within a harmonious system, uh, a system that's not based on national boundaries, but instead on on nature, on ecology, on um, what will provide habitable, survivable conditions for everyone. Um, so, eating up a lot of time here. I want to just mention a little bit about the specifics of this argument. And, you know, Bonds walks through a number of the consequences of climate change, which I just mentioned also. Um, but what's interesting is his analysis of why we don't act. And this is where the structural violence comes in, right? That the structural violence is not just the degradation of nature that's caused by uh, industrialization, capitalism, etc. It's also found in the political system that protects those corporations that are doing the greatest amount of damage, like the fossil fuel corporations. Uh, so he writes, right? In addition to lobbying and providing campaign contributions to help defeat or weaken climate change legislation, fossil fuel companies and their individual owners, shareholders, have played a major role in funding think tank driven climate change denialism. So, on the one hand, fossil fuel companies uh, have protected themselves from legislation that would hurt their profits in the name of protecting the environment by exploiting, right, the pay for play nature of American politics through lobbying, right? You contribute $1 million to a Senate campaign. You get that senator elected. That senator, you can extract certain promises from that senator. That senator won't vote to regulate the fossil fuel industry. It won't vote to sign on to the Paris Climate Agreement, things like that. And so, basic policy manipulation through lobbying. But it's doing something even more nefarious, right? And this has, been revealed by sociological studies, political studies, and this is what Bonds is talking about. And this is, I think, really the key point to understanding what structural racism, structural violence is about, right? What's structural is the construction of discourse, right? Or you might say the poisoning of discourse, the creation of arguments that are not organically generated, but are the product of corporate spending, right? Through funding think tanks, through, right, placing articles, through having certain spokesmen appear on TV. And the argument is that the whole phenomenon of climate change denialism, right, is a corporate project, a project of fossil fuel companies that need to fight back against uh, the argument that they are, right, polluting. So climate change denial is, according to this article, according to a lot of research, right, the product of propaganda efforts, propaganda in favor of fossil fuel companies. And, you know, this is so important to understand that often those ideologies that are expressed as, that are the ideologies of the uneducated, the ideologies of um, the uninformed, are not what they are presented to be. That is common sense, organic beliefs, right? But are instead the product of propaganda campaigns by very powerful entities that feed that ideology to the uneducated and uninformed uh, in order to, right, meet some agenda. Right? This is often, yeah. Um, and that whole phenomenon is very interesting. But in any case, so climate denialism, climate change denialism, is an example of this, right? In which corporations are able to change the dialogue by, you know, injecting society with this sort of false talking point, false consciousness. Right? Um, so, major oil, gas, and coal corporations have played and continue to play a critical role in the unfolding crisis of climate change by both extracting and selling the fossil fuels that are driving global warming, but also by successfully working to defeat or water down public efforts to reduce fossil fuel dependency. Right? This is the structural violence. It's not just the original violence. It's also uh, the watering down, the whitewashing, the distortion of information that follows that original violence. Um, we see this uh, as a corollary to structural racist violence, also, right? Uh, where when a police officer kills an unarmed black man, there is immediately, a push to explain away in some way that behavior, right? That phenomenon. Uh, Now, that maybe is not a product of corporate interest, but instead of state interest. Right? But the point is that the discourse is manipulated by powerful actors who have an interest in concealing uh, their own wrongdoing. Right. Uh, so I think the final thing I'll say is, you know, well, I'll say two more things. That the fossil fuel companies have known about the damage that fossil fuels creates since the 70s, right? Just as the tobacco companies knew for decades that smoking was harmful. Uh, they didn't acknowledge it, they covered it up, and they did everything they could to prevent the public from finding out. Right? If we can acknowledge that, uh, you know, tobacco companies were harming public health and lying about it for decades, and we can hold them responsible, uh, then analogously, the same should be true of fossil fuel companies, right? They knew for decades the damage that burning fossil fuels did to the environment. They covered it up, they didn't acknowledge it, and they did everything they could to prevent the public from becoming aware of that. Right? That is, that's a crime. Um, okay, so the final thing I'll say, and this is, Eric Bonds mentions a number of these milestones and thresholds in the paper, but they were recently sort of made official, formalized by the United Nations Commission on or Panel on Climate Change. Uh, yeah, the name is something like that. And here are the numbers that are important. Uh, what the Paris Climate Agreement aims for is to keep uh, global warming from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Uh, if warming stays below 1.5 degrees Celsius, evidence suggests that the transformation of the planet will be short of catastrophic, short of genuinely apocalyptic. It is truly disastrous. More recent research has suggested that even warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius would have cataclysmic results. The number that the UN ultimately warns against is 2 degrees Celsius of warming. At that stage, there would be genuine global cataclysm, right? A real problem. As I said, right, more recent research suggests 1.5 could be as bad. Now, to keep warming from reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius, what is required, scientists project, is to halve our current carbon emissions by 50% by the year 2030, and to bring carbon emissions to zero by 2050. Right? So far, the United States has increased its emissions every year for the last 10 years, I believe. Certainly, emissions went up from 2019 to 2020. Or actually, that's 2018 to 2019. I'm not sure what 2020 looked like. But the point is, we haven't begun to do what we need to do to have our carbon emissions. So what we're looking at, what needs to happen, is essentially a complete transformation of our economy in 10 years and a complete end to fossil fuel consumption within 30 years. The question is, how is this possible? How can this be done? That's the question. All right. We'll leave it at that for today, and I will see you next week.